discussion so we can all share your memories of Portsmouth's pop history. So without further ado, please welcome Dave Allen.
Where you been? Nice to see you. The Lovets are here. It's all right where you start now. Actually, yeah, I'm going to get a T-shirt. Legendary. I like you. Oh, maybe not. No. It is. These things are constantly, endlessly two-way, and I mean, the truth of it is, I just happen to be the focal point of a lot of things that go on with a lot of people. Mick, who's written a book with me, is full of cold, but he's waving at the back there with a cup of coffee in his hand, and I won't get any close to him tonight because you might catch germs off him. There are a lot of other people who shared a lot of things in this what I've now come to call Pompey Pop project. Although that is a somewhat grand title for something that was. It's utterly ad hoc, really, and just kind of keeps rambling away and developing and moving on and so on and so on. But magical things happen all the time. So I did a thing for the 60 Plus Festival recently, which is yeah, I've just about qualified for that plus, we did a thing at the Guildhall, and again, you may have heard of this. I'm going to plug things endlessly all night probably, but one of the reasons that I'm not doing pictures tonight is that in a venue of this size it's kind of complicated. Another is that there are something like 450 pictures in the book anyway, which I know a lot of you have got. Another is that there are lots and lots of pictures on the website and the blog, and if you don't know where that is, I've got strips of paper over there that will tell you how to access all those, and that's my website, Mick's website. Now there's another man standing by the column here called Nigel Grundy. I'll tell you more about him later on. He's video recording this, but he also publishes lots of stuff. He's got a website, and there's a blog that I run on a daily basis. So there are lots and lots of places to find pictures, including this thing called Access All Areas at the Guildhall, which has just opened, which in the advert advertises principally a travelling exhibition which is about the Rolling Stones, and that will disappear in November, and there'll be another one that follows it, sort of backstage top of the Pops photographs, and then another one that follows that about Bob Dylan. But the thing that Mick and Nigel and I have done with other people is create what I call the biggest scrapbook in the world, which is a kind of pictorial history of Pompey pop music. And it starts in 1944, and it gets pretty hiccupy by the time we get to about 1970 or 71. And that's, there are two reasons for that, really. It starts in 1944 because D-Day is a bit key in terms of popular music in Portsmouth, in terms of the access to venues and live music and so on. So for example, in 1944, nobody could use the Savoy Ballroom. I'm going to kind of assume quite often that you know where these places are, but occasionally I'll stop myself and say, the Savoy Ballroom is that flat bunch of rubble that Harry Redknapp was once one of the glories of Portsmouth, but is now just a wreck. But bless him, Harry's now selling his autobiography, so when he's made lots of money he'll rebuild it, I'm sure. Well, maybe not. And the South Parade Pier was they were out of bounds because they were being used for the services, so there was no entertainment going on. And just shortly after the war, it became one of the first purchases of Billy Butlin before he went into the holiday camp business, the Savoy, and the South Parade Pier opened up as well. And there will certainly be some people in the audience tonight who will remember with some fondness through the 50s and by the late 50s, the big dance bands that would particularly come on a Friday night to the Savoy. Now I think, sometimes one has to speculate about these things, but I think the explanation for that is on the whole fairly simple. As I remember it, Dockyard Payday was a Thursday. So if you waited till Saturday for the big night, you didn't have a chance, really, because all the money had gone. Okay, so the big night was Friday night. Okay, and they had what was called Radio Dance Band Night, and all the big dance bands like the Ted Heath Band and the Joe Loss Band and so on and so on and so on came, and that was a great tradition. And you went there to dance, and you went there to fall in love, and all those great things that popular music are, you know, built for. And South Parade Pier was particularly notable, I think, on, I'm too young to remember all this, but I think it was particularly notable for trad jazz when that was And I'm not going to get myself embroiled in the discussion here about things like what's the difference between revivalist jazz and trad jazz, although I'm perfectly content to have that conversation with anybody, because I would like to add that I shan't talk all evening. They did say how long you're going to do, and I said, well, do you want the 6-day version or the short one? And if you've never heard me speak before, you'll soon realise that I could do a 6-day version of this without repetition, hesitation, or any of the other things I'm not allowed to do. But I won't. So, you know, we'll have some exchange, and I'll invite questions, and we'll do about an hour, and then I'll shut up. But if we stay till closing time and you buy me lots of beer, that's perfectly fine. And we can get into the minutiae of British revivalist jazz and British traditional jazz and how they were different and how they led to whatever came after it and so on. But Acker Bilk and Chris Barber and Humphrey Littleton and all those kinds of people would play the Savoy, but they'd also turn up at the South Great Pier. Which doesn't tell you a lot about the magic.
Saturday night it was, though.
And Sunday night?
Sunday night at South Great.
Sunday night, that's right, yeah. So, and I guess it was just that the traditional jazz people were kind of more earnest, really, and they spent Friday night reading beatnik novels, you know, like Jack Kerouac. So they still had a bit of money left on Sunday night. And that's my anticipation. But again, John can tell us later about that. So how do I know all these things? God knows, really. I mean, it's a bit like the cricket. I've just written this book about 150 years of Hampshire cricket, and somebody said, how long did it take you to write it? And I said, well, in one sense I started on January the 1st this year, and in another sense it's been since about 1963, when I first wrote something, a history of Hampshire cricket for a school project, which wasn't brilliantly received. So you could argue that it just goes on forever and is all a sign of a misspent past, really. Sometimes I don't remember. Sometimes I genuinely don't remember things, and I wonder whether I know the answer to it and what the answer might be, and so on and so on. And sometimes, as I say, magical things happen. So I did this thing for the pensioners, this 60+ thing at the Guildhall with the big exhibition, and I noticed that there was a name of a gentleman from Hayling Island who's... Actually, I can't see him now. Where is he? Oh, he's round there. He's hiding from me. Hello, Harry.
From Hackney, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, mate. Okay. From Hackney. Okay, so Harry from Hackney, and I said to him quite gently, really, excuse me, Mr. Feld, are you Mark Boland's brother? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, do you mind if people know? And he said, no, I don't. So, ladies and gentlemen, Harry Feld, Mark Boland's brother, over there. And yeah, you give him a round of applause, right? But that wasn't the end of the magic, you see, because then I said, because I had this list of people who were coming, you see, and so I introduced myself to his other half, who said, you know me. And I looked at her and I thought, go on. And she was at one time my sister's best pal. And I had not seen, I haven't seen you since about 1965 or something like that, anyway. So this evening she turns up with a photocopy from the Evening News on Thursday, May the 6th, 1963. Five, sorry, cool. I'm getting old. 65, yes, actually, yeah, my sister would have been in trouble if she'd gone out in May 1963, yeah, she's younger than me, yeah. May the 6th, 1965, and there's a picture of Ray Davies and the Kinks on the stage at the Guildhall, and you can't really see, it doesn't matter terribly, but Sandra is kind of gesturing imploringly to Ray Davies at the age of about 14, and next to her gazing with a rather elegant pose into the camera is my sister. Hey. I've never seen that before. That's quite extraordinary. So these things happen all the time, which connects me with why did it shift from just being memories that everybody has? Because we all, I have a quite serious conviction and a quite serious idea that that our life experience, and I suppose, let me say that I'm delighted that there are some people in here who are less than 30, and if you want a copy of the book, you can have it for a £5. I just think that in itself that's wonderful, really. And if you're over 30 and you want a cheap copy of the book, bribe them. I do think there was a thing on television a couple of weeks ago. There was a report from Parliament where people were reporting on problems with older people and loneliness and older people not having things to do and losing some sense of purpose and will in their life. Now, I think that there are many things in the world that are much more important than the entertainment that we enjoy in our lives, and I find myself frequently saying the same thing about cricket. You know, when I'm going absolutely berserk because Hampshire have lost and played rubbish again, you know, I have to kind of say, it's only cricket, it doesn't really matter. you know. And actually, the same thing in an odd kind of way is true of music, except it's not entirely. And I think that sometimes when people get to particular ages, it really is quite seriously possible to enrich your life in all kinds of ways by delving into those memories and working with them in very particular ways. And there's a man called J.B. Priestley who could write properly, who I think articulates it rather better than I do. So I'm just going to offer you this quote. Now, he wasn't talking about what I call popular music because he was writing an awfully long time ago. He was writing before Elvis, so he calls it light music. And again, some of us will remember that way back, the BBC played what we would call pop music on the light programme. So there was this idea of something called light music as opposed to something called heavy or serious music. So J.B. Priestley, the novelist, says, so-called light music has its own values. It acts as a series of bottles, often charmingly shaped and coloured for the distillations of memory. The first few bars of it remove the stopper. We find ourselves reliving, not remembering, but magically reliving some exact moments of our past. I think that's delightful. I think it's absolutely charming. And it seems to me that the project that I've ended up involved in, called Pompey Pop, is one very productive way of helping older people in particular to make sense of their life and get greater meaning out of their life and have a greater sense of self than they might have otherwise. And if it does nothing more, we had an example of it on Sunday night where a band that hadn't played together for 40 years in Portsmouth but made a sort of cult album on Polydor in 1970. They got on stage here on Sunday night and played some songs from that album, which Record Collector magazine is about to issue again. And there are only 3 of the 5 left. One has died, one is in France and poorly and couldn't do it, but they had a couple of depths and they played a terrific set, and a lot of people who remembered things 40 years ago came and just relived that moment in a rather special way. And I think my conviction is that at least as we get older, that's a very powerful experience, and it is more than just remembering. It is about reliving, and in a quite special way. So that takes me into an explanation of how I started, because I'm surrounded actually by publications about Pompey Pop. And one of the things I always say about popular music in Portsmouth is that in the great scheme of things, in the great history of things, we can't make huge claims. You know, there was never a Beatles, you know, there was never a Who or a Rolling Stones. There have been odd things that are quite special, but there wasn't anything like that. What there were some remarkable venues, and probably still are, and some remarkable audiences. And I'm sometimes minded of the relationship between audiences in Portsmouth who enjoy popular music and the reputation of the fans of the football club. There is something quite extraordinary, really, about people putting up with, you know, little spurts of success, okay, but decades of mediocrity at Fratton Park and still turning up and being enthusiastic and committed and so on and so on. And I think sometimes that's happened in popular music as well. Okay, that's a generalisation. In particular, why did I start doing it? Well, the answer is very simple. I was an academic, and I did a PhD, and I did lots of writing and publishing, and I guess I've got away with words and so on. And it's not quite true that university lecturers have 3 months off in the summer to go to the south of France. They usually only have about 2. And for the rest of the time they have to do a little bit of work, you see. So in the early 1990s, I actually worked quite hard on a PhD, you know, and ended up finishing that in about 1996. And entirely coincidentally, because my father had died and my mother was very ill, I moved back into that house that you used to come and visit my sister-in-law. I moved back into my parents' house with my wife. For a few months in order to try and deal with things and sort things out and so on. And I found myself sat in this place of where I was perhaps in priestly sense reliving these memories I think the summer of 1996, and I wrote a very personal history about my life in popular music in Portsmouth. And it didn't pretend to be anything more than that, really. So I wrote about going to the Birdcage or Kimball's or being in a band in 1968 or 69 and so on and so on. But I didn't attempt to make that in any sense a kind of a bigger objective history at all. It was quite a chatty thing, and it was called almost 40 years of South Sea Rock and Pompey Blues. And loads of people over the years didn't get it at all, really, and it's partly because the printing was crap and there's supposed to be a colon there. And I've been twice on Radio Solent where this bloke said, well, why don't you call it 38 years then? And I said, no, it's almost 40 years of, yeah, well, that's 39 or 30. Actually, the whole cover was a disappointment to me, really, because there's a really serious picture of me with a decent haircut and severe glasses on the back, and this very pretty picture of me on the... I was pretty, wasn't I? Outrageously pretty. And the plan was that there was this pretty boy with his microphone looking over his shoulder, and the very stern picture was going to be there. So he was looking over his shoulder at what he'd become and wondering. And they cocked that up, didn't they? I only have one copy of it now, and my life is falling apart. And that's a funny story about all these things, because they disappeared. All that happened with that was it was a kind of vanity publishing project, and they went broke and pulled the bloody lot. So that's in 1996, but I quite enjoyed it. And I then wrote something that went online. That was called 1,000 Years of Heaven. Now, Mick Cooper, that I was telling you about, he played in Heaven. This was at that point when, incidentally, I got tons of music that I could play you, but I'm conscious of the fact that every time I play you a track, that's 3 minutes of chat gone. So if you get really fed up and say, play me some music, I will, but because I've got a Heaven track somewhere, for instance. Mick and I, in the late 60s, were playing in that psychedelic phase, in those kinds of bands, you know, where we were writing, you know, songs about wizards and gnomes and pixies, and you know, we were taking all those funny sherbet sweets and you know, imagining, you know, songs lasted 20 minutes and all that kind of stuff. We went through that phase, Mick, didn't we? We came out of it the other end. Actually, that was interesting. In the 1970s, how did we come out of it? People came out of it in different ways. Some of the mods that I'd spent a lot of my time with at the Birdcage, including one or two people, I'm not going to finger too many people, there's certainly one or two people here tonight who stayed very committed to that whole soul thing that happened in the mid-60s in Portsmouth at that club called the Birdcage. Has everybody heard of the Birdcage? Yeah, okay. And it wasn't far up the road. But if anybody hasn't and wants to talk about the Birdcage, I'm not the only person here who could talk about that until Friday morning, if you want to. And some people stayed very, very committed to that, which was partly about very smart dressing, consciously very smart dressing, and partly about really top quality black American soul music that you could dance to, and so on and so on. And it persists, you know. Last Saturday night at the Conservative Club in Albert Road, it was still happening, and some of those people were still there dancing. The last time I went, and this is honestly the truth, the last time I went there, I spent the next day walking around like this with a groin strain because I danced all night. So I didn't go last Saturday, but never mind. So some people did that, and then there was that kind of very experimental psychedelic thing that some of us got into, including Heaven and a band called Coconut Mushroom and so on. And a lot of that stuff's been reissued recently on obscure little labels. And I guess after that, some of us got a bit lost. So Mick went into mainstream entertainment. You played the honky tonk bar in the Savoy as a keyboard player and so on and so on. And I went completely the opposite way into a kind of very, very roots thing where, and I've almost done nothing ever since, where I just play 1920s blues stuff, really. So I think that's a kind of interesting phenomenon of popular music, that sometimes it's not that people get lost, but it is that sometimes people can't keep progressing. You can't keep doing that new thing. You can't keep finding that new way of shifting on. But many years later, I wrote this account of those psychedelic times called 1,000 Days of Heaven, and I just took the name Heaven because it was one of the finer bands at the time. and it fitted very much with the title of this book, Almost, which I think is a tale to tell of a great many musicians, at least of our generation, possibly of many generations around Portsmouth before and since. An awful lot of musicians have mixed band made an album in Denmark Street and they've still got copies of it. It would be nice if it was a slightly cleaner copy, but the copies exist of him, but it never came out. I was in a band that had a recording contract with Polydor. We made one single, which occasionally you see on eBay for about 75 quid, which is just bonkers. Oh, and it's on Google, it's on YouTube as well, yeah. And it's, I think you should know that it's psych pop. We didn't know at the time that it was psych pop, but if you look it up on YouTube now, that's what it is.
No, what was it? Was it Harlem Speakeasy?
Well, it is Harlem Speakeasy, but it's not the A side, which was it's the flip side, which is called Sights of Pegasus, which now gets put on YouTube. So that's right, yes. Coconut Mushroom signed to Apple, and it just didn't quite happen for them. But those tracks that they recorded have been put out recently on a English psychedelic compilation CD and so on and so on. So Almost is one of those stories about people who didn't fail, who almost made it, but didn't quite get there for some reason. And other people wrote things as well. There is incidentally a cautionary tale. I think one of the nice things about this is it's a Bookfest. So a cautionary tale is that I wrote this thing called 1,000 Days of Heaven, which is almost 3 years of the psychedelic period in Portsmouth. And it's not just about Portsmouth groups, it's about groups that came here as well. It's about people we saw. So Country Joe and the Fish, for instance, played at South Parade Pier just before they played at Woodstock. The Velvet Underground came a little later, although Lou Reed wasn't in them by then, and so on and so on. But the cautionary tale is that went up on something called Sweet Floral Albion, which is a website about that kind of music. And that's been publishing for some time now, and you can find most editions of it, but you can't find the edition on which I wrote about 1,000 Days of Heaven. It redirected me almost immediately to what I could figure as, I don't know Spanish, but as far as I could tell it was a Spanish site selling Viagra. I wanted acid, but that wasn't on, so there we are. But other people have told these stories as well. So I mean, this was an interesting one about that time. I'd done Almost, and then I'd kind of gone to sleep and thought, well, that's done that. I'll get on with other things in my life and even work occasionally and so on. Then a man called Keith Francis produced this thing called Seaside Rock, and this is a lovely book. Sadly, Keith died a couple of years ago, but this is a quite delightful account of a period before I was involved in Portsmouth popular music. It's an account of the late 50s and early 60s, and it tells stories about where they got the gear from. I don't know how well you can see there, and some of you may not be nuts about this anyway, but these guys are holding Fender Stratocasters. This was a thing to die for in about 1961, and I believe that a man called Mark Tuddenham bought the first one in Portsmouth in a place called Bennett's in Fratton Road. But these are parts of the myths and legends that may or may not be true, and kind of who cares really, but imagine that, Fender Stratocaster. You notice also they're all very smart, they're all wearing matching suits and ties and have nice hairdos and so on and so on. And they're coming in on that sort of late rock and roll, and then the Ricky Nelson and all that kind of pop stuff, Everly Brothers thing and so on and so on. And their great claim to fame is that in early April 1963, it's their turn to be the support band at the Savoy. Now the Savoy ballroom was huge. Okay, I mean I don't know how many people you could get in there, but 1,000, do you think? Yeah, about 1,000 probably. And there was a big gallery at the back, and there was a stage. There was a main stage here where the big band would play, and there was a stage on the side where the support band would play. And in the 50s dance band days, the support bands would be, the resident local. Benny Friedman Orchestra was one of the local bands, and they had a guy in there called Jock Shulman, for example, whose 3 sons became the Shulman brothers in Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, and then Gentle Giant. So there are those lovely family stories that develop through history. So and there were some really fine local bands in the early 60s. And to their great credit, the local evening news, the local paper in the evening news, ran a profile on one of these bands every week. For about 20 weeks they did this. And you can still check them out now. And at least one of those bands, Danny Raven and the Renegades, are still performing around town. They're still doing that kind of rock and roll stuff and all the rest of it. And one of them will be 70 next year, but they are complete. The whole band is still together. I think, incidentally, there is a book to be written someday about bands from the 60s that are all still alive. There aren't many of them. And the most extraordinary one, yes, do it quick, yes. The most extraordinary one, given their life history, is Country Joe and the Fish, as it happens. You know, all the original guys are Man from Man are still alive, for instance. That's another one. So that's the Sea Air, I guess. That's on it. But the wonderful story about these guys is that on this particular night, it's their turn to be the support act. And I don't know what they got paid, probably 10 quid. And there was a guy called George Turner who ran the Savoy and booked all the support acts in those days. And he just happened to have booked, and the famous story is that he booked them for 50 quid, but who knows if that's just a myth or legend or whether it's more true. He just happened to have booked this bunch from Liverpool called the Beatles. And it was about a month after Please Please Me got to #1. Now, did Please Please Me get to #1? That's another one of those kind of endless quarrels. Please Please Me got to #1 in the British charts, in every chart that was published except Record Retailer, which is the only one that's now used, but was the one that no kids at the time ever looked at. So if you bought Disc or Record Mirror or New Musical Express or Melody Maker, they got the #1 with Please Please Me, and if you didn't, you know, if you're in the business, they only got the #2, which is too unromantic for words as far as I'm concerned. So they got to #1. And Mike Devon and the Diplomats play support to them and have all sorts of stories, not least that Terry Wiseman, the drummer, who's still about and is in the South Sea Shakespeare Actors now. He's a thespian, but keep it quiet. He had a drum kit, and Ringo's drum kit didn't appear because there was a crash on the A3 somewhere, and so the Diplomats played, and then they had to drag all the drums across here, lend them to Ringo. Ringo bashed away on the drums, the people played a set, and then back they go, and the Diplomats play another set. And the biggest mistake in Terry Wiseman's life is that a couple of years later he sold the drum kit. How tragic is that? But certainly at least one of the wives of one, or I think girlfriends in those days, kept the album cover that had all been signed. And they had a slightly difficult evening actually, because by that time they were quite into the Beatles and had learned, this album had only been out 2 or 3 weeks, but they'd learned all the tracks. And they had to talk to the Beatles about which ones they were allowed to play while the Beatles performed. But that was Savoy days. The Beatles also, of course, played twice at Portsmouth. And another one of those great myths that's been published in the books about the Beatles is that when they went on their second major tour, the first major tour they went on was with Helen Shapiro. And there was a girl trio on that tour called the Honeys, who were better known locally as the Liddell Sisters. And they then went on tour with Chris Montez and Tommy Rowe, Let's Dance and Sheila, and they played at the Guildhall in late March. And there have been at least 2 quite major histories of the Beatles that said that by that time they were so big that Chris Montez and Tommy Rowe were relegated and the Beatles closed the show. Now, it happens entirely by chance. It's an entirely fortuitous thing. There's nothing clever about this. That it was the first concert at the Guildhall I ever saw. Was the Tommy Rowe, Chris Montez Beatles concert, and the only thing I can only remember 2 things about it clearly. One is that Chris Montez took his shirt off while he was singing La Bamba, and the girls went a bit bonkers. And the other is that I ate a bar of Galaxy and felt sick. And I can't remember anything about the Beatles except that I was thrilled to see them. I was thrilled to see them, I know that, but I can remember nothing about it, except that I'm absolutely sure that they did not close the show. And only today, I came across a book in Gunwharf in that remaindered bookshop. There's a guy that wrote a book about the early Beatles tours, and it was about 20 quid. And I thought, oh God, I don't need another book about the Beatles, let alone about anything to do with 1960s really. So I never bought it, but it was 4 quid today, so I bought it. And I read it. And in it, there is a much fuller explanation of these terrible backstage quarrels between the managers of Tommy Rowe and Chris Montez and the Beatles, and who was going to finish and so on. And the Beatles didn't close the show, so my memory was right. It was one of those things that I asked when in 2009 I did a talk a bit like this at the Theatre Royal, and this was another book that I did at the time called Here Come the 60s. And I think at the time not a lot of people knew about this, but my wife had said to me, because my wife's very kind to me about these things and usually takes a hand in them, because I've never got a clue. And she kept saying, so what are you going to do on your 60th birthday then? We ought to do something special. What do you want to do? You know, and I'm not big on parties and stuff really. I'm never sure what I wanted to do. And I'd won a teaching award that I was allowed to use, quite a lot of money, but I was allowed, it was a national teaching award, and I was allowed to use it for anything to enhance teaching. So I bought a couple of things for the department, and I had a whack of money left. And I went to the boss and said, it doesn't say that this has to be teaching for university undergraduates. I was working at the university at the time, does it? You know, it just says it's got to be educational. And he said, yeah, that's all right, yeah. So what I did was I said, well, I'd like to, on my 60th birthday, what I'd like to do is a talk called Here Come the 60s at the Theatre Royal. So I booked the Theatre Royal with some of the money and produced the booklet with the rest of it. And we just gave it out on the day, a bit like the Manfred Mann thing, really, which I just thought was great fun, to be honest. It's the kind of book you've got to care about, you know. I mean, it just... The climax appeared at the Savoy, the Portsmouth-based G-Boys from Gibraltar and the Sheiks of R&B at the Cellar Club, while Arthur Ward's band was still playing Clarence Pier every Saturday. There's about 300 pages like that. So you've got to be pretty keen to find out about the G-Boys, okay. But there is a reason for that. I wrote a script, but I'll notice the scripts really, and I can kind of remember it. There is a reason for all of that. This was 2009, okay? There are two reasons for it. One is that Mick and I were now working together on all of this, because we just, and this is another one of those magical moments. Now, I do get a bit, it's either psychedelic or metaphysical, I'm not sure, but I'm being quite honest about this. I do think that there are energies out there somewhere that take a hand in these things sometimes, and it's not anything to do with whether I'm clever or not. Things just happen, people get put together, stuff happens, and I'm fairly convinced of it really. I read it in a John Peel column in 1969 and I've believed it ever since. You didn't get that one, never mind, I'll explain that later. Perfumed Garden, International Times. You were all too well behaved, you see. I will explain it later. And so I'm in the library one day doing a bit of research for all of this, and Mick Cooper walks in, and I say, Mick Cooper, I haven't seen you since you were behind a Hammond organ. And he says, Dave, and it wasn't true, but Dave Allen, what are you up to? And he was up to the same thing as me. So I said, well, we can have a competition, or we can help each other, and we helped each other, and it's been just fantastic. It's absolutely just brilliant, because he has such an eye for the detail of things, whereas you can tell that I've got a way with words, but they do kind of wander about a bit sometimes, you know. So Mick keeps me anchored with that kind of detail, and that was very important. Now, the same thing has since happened in my re-encountering Nigel Grundy. He went to the same school as me, the man who's doing the video called, and he's done his own book, which is called My Back Pages. And the great story about Nigel is that he's the photographer, so he's got this extraordinary wealth of photographs. And he's a photographer because he had one of those John Bull printing outfits and made himself a press pass and just blagged his way into every gig in Pompey, and they all believed him. I mean, he never had to pay to get in, which is outrageous, really. The best I could ever do was forge the stamp at the birdcage. You know, I used to get in free there sometimes. So you find all this stuff collecting together. Why does it matter? Well, okay, here goes. I'm going to tell you now. There are two reasons why it matters. And I probably will just go briefly to the script, if you don't mind. The first reason that it mattered was that around 2000 in particular, and in the years running up to it, a lot of people produced local histories of all kinds of things, particularly this idea that we're reaching the year 2000, we're going to produce local histories about what went on in Portsmouth in the 20th century. And I, of course, went to them with a great sense of enthusiasm to see what they had to say about entertainment and leisure. And on the whole, in terms of my life experience, and I have lived my whole life, I have worked outside of Portsmouth, but in my entire life I have always had a home address south of Fratton Bridge and north of the Solent. All 64 years of it, okay? So I kind of feel like I know the place fairly well. And I would read these accounts of things that went on in the theatre and the cinema and so on, and think there's nothing wrong with these accounts, but they entirely miss what I experienced. Now, when I say I experienced, what I mean is a lot of people in this room and hundreds more people out there. You know, I kept thinking, what about all those people I went to Kimball's with, I went to the Birdcage with, what about all those people who in the 50s went to the Rendezvous and the Savoy and so on? How come nobody's written anything in there about it? And I went to the City Museum where a lot of that work went on. And we are talking here about academic historians. We are talking about, they weren't necessarily writing, you know, what you call theoretical academic work, but they were academic historians. And I went to the museum, where I got to know them quite well in various ways, and said, what's the story about this? And they said, these historians, who are professional historians, are all archival historians, and there are no archives. Where do they go to read about? Who's got an archive of anything that went on at the Birdcage? You know, and the answer, in a sense, the answer is simply that the archive, such as it is, exists almost exclusively in the files of the Evening News, and in particular in the small ads. So you can imagine now that what Mick and I did for months and months and months was just read the microfilm of the Evening News, and in particular the small ads, which are astonishing, because in the small ads you do find out who was at Hillside Youth Club on November the 13th, 1967. Now, clearly what happened was that the more we did this, the more people found out about it, and the more they would come and say, well, I got this or I got that, and so on and so on. We had a couple of lunches at my place, a couple of tea parties, and people knew people, and they brought people along and said, I've got a set list from 1961, or we got the complete books of Coconut Mushroom. Now, Coconut Mushroom from 1967 were fully professional, they were going abroad and so on and so on, and they had to keep books which even told us how much they were paying for guitar strings and drumsticks and all the rest of it, but what gigs they were doing, that, you know, they were going to the Steering Wheel in Weymouth and so on and so on. And so what we've said, really, is that the job that we have is to build up that archive. And so sometimes that can be quite entertaining, and certainly Nigel's book, although it, like my Almost, is written in a very personal way, is just packed full of really, really fascinating photographs, intriguing pictures. You should see him at the Woburn Hippie Festival, I tell you. This book has some pictures in it, but it was very deliberately a list of everything I could get right. And I know that it's not, you know, that you never get it all right. And I mean, I'm going to do the same thing tomorrow night with the cricket book, you know, which is absolutely crammed full of facts. And the first two, I got an email and a phone call from the first two people to buy it, who both told me that I'd forgotten to name Basingstoke as one of the grounds pictured on the front cover. And when the second guy rang me up, I said, what did you think about the 17,386 things I got right? There you go. You can't win them all. So we did a number of other things. In 2003, the City Museum did this, and you can still buy this, and it's a kind of oral history of Portsmouth called Singing Out, and it covers that period that we're talking about, right from the dance band days through trad jazz, through big groups, and in fact longer than we did. You can still buy that there, and it has the strengths of oral history in that what it offers you is a very honest account of particular experiences that people lived through as members of groups. I was going to say there is a weakness to oral history. It's not fair to say this in a sense, because it's not something oral history claims to do. But what it tends to be, therefore, is a list of personal accounts. It doesn't necessarily stand back and take a kind of bigger overview picture. And in fairness, neither have we so far, because we've done this, which is a list of facts. And then they've done that, which is a list of personal memories. and then Nigel and my book are personal memories, and then the one that we're talking about mostly tonight, the Pompey Pop pics, is just absolutely full of photographs with very little in the way of words at all. You know, occasionally I make some kind of general comments about shifts in the way that popular music has changed over the period, and there's an implicit attempt to define what I mean by popular music, but it's implicit. Now, because I am an academic, that's one of those things that I could go on about forever and probably wouldn't be terribly enthralling to you. There is an organisation that I'm a member of called the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, and it is very, very academic. And there is a publication it's done where people have said that people have challenged the notion of whether popular music is a useful term or not. I'll tell you briefly why I use the term popular music and I don't use the term pop, and that is precisely really well, for two reasons. One is that there is a link, there is a relationship between the word popular and the word population, and therefore there's a sense in which it's the music of people. Okay, now, you know, I think it was Leadbelly who once said, I don't understand the idea of folk music because I've never heard a horse sing it, you know. So there is a sense in which all music belongs to people, but it's that notion of the collective thing. The other with the extent to which popular music is more than very local, because it's produced either as a live event or as a recorded event, and these days that might be visually recorded as well, at least partly for commercial purposes. Okay, so even the more radical, way out, experimental, post-punk, you know, nihilistic, etc., whatever group you've ever heard, if they can't afford to put petrol in the van, they're not going to get to the next gig. So there's always some element of having to have a bit of money to do the gig, a bit of money to buy the drum kit, and so on, which gets completely out of control, of course, when it's the Rolling Stones at Hyde Park, and you know, gets beyond the ticket prices get beyond the amount that I would ever want to pay to see anybody in the world, really, unless anybody could bring Muddy Waters back to life with his early 1950s band. That would get it. I'd pay £1,000 for that. But that's reincarnation, and I'm not sure we've got anybody who can do that yet. So I mean by popular music all of those things, really. I mean that kind of cutting-edge experimental stuff. I mean chirpy, chirpy, cheep, cheep. I mean folk music. I mean traditional jazz. I mean dance bands. I mean, you know, all the stuff that you could ever go and see at any of those venues. And in terms of the history of popular music, one of the things that Mick and I have done, I think, by choosing to go back to 1944, is to challenge the idea that the sea change, and there was a sea change when, you know, in 1956, without any question, there was a sea change with Lonnie Donegan and Rock Island Line, the first Elvis records coming out in Britain and so on. There was a sea change. The sea change was partly technical. It was partly that suddenly it was people playing guitars, bass and drums who were making the most exciting music. It was that suddenly all these, you know, 5 trombones and 6 trumpets and 8 saxophones and so on were not any longer the hit music, so on and so on. There were those sea changes. They were very important. It was absolutely vital in 1963 that the success of the Beatles in 1963 was built on the fact that they couldn't just sing and play, but they could write as well. And they survived in a way that some other beat groups of that particular early period didn't, because they couldn't write, and they were completely contained as a consequence. And what happened by the time that people like Mick and I were signing contracts in the late 60s was that it was almost a condition that you would write. So people didn't write in the early 60s, and they did write in the late 60s, and it wasn't because musicians were better in the late 60s, it was just because managers wanted to do deals where they got your publishing rights as well as your recording rights as well as your performing rights. It was that simple, and they said, you will write, so we did. Nobody said that to bands in 1959, so they didn't. You know, it wasn't that there was suddenly this great flowering of creativity. The guys in 59 and 60 could have written just as well had people encouraged them. So that was a massive change too. The other thing to say about it is this: there's a guy called Bob Stanley who's just written one of the biggest histories of popular music that can ever have been written, and it's called Yeah, 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 and he just covers absolutely everything. It's quite extraordinary, except I don't know how many pages it is, 800 or 900 pages, except that it's almost entirely based around the history of pop records. Okay. Now, what you get from those kinds of histories is a reliable history, because suddenly you have got an archive. Suddenly there is an archive. We know what the Beatles recorded. We know what the Rolling Stones recorded. You know, we know what the Glenn Miller Band recorded, and so on and so on. So you've got this reliable archive that you can then tell a history about. You can talk about the way in which the Beatles' clothes changed at the time that their sound changed in 1966 and 67, and then you can tell all sorts of stories about how they stopped playing live and experimented in the studio, and how suddenly there were 4 tracks instead of 2 tracks, and then 8 tracks instead of 4, and you could multi-track and change sounds and so on. You can tell that story, and that story is archived and factual, and that's okay. But that story misses all those little bands that play in youth clubs that change people's lives. You know, the first live gig I actually ever saw wasn't the Beatles at the Guildhall, it was Barry and the Strollers at St Nicholas's Youth Club in Cotton. And they were great, and I'm still in touch with some of them. In fact, a couple of them came to that 60 plus do, yeah? And there are pictures of them up in the Guildhall. And they probably weren't great at all, but I thought they were amazing. And I thought, I want to do that. So I did, which is something quite lovely as well. And those local histories and those extraordinary moments where things happen in live ways and sometimes hardly anybody sees it and so on, they're not always fully documented. But it is absolutely the project that we're engrossed in at the minute. I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to repeat that I'm entirely willing. First of all, I'm going to shut up in a minute and say, you want to say anything or ask any questions, and also I really am entirely willing to talk all night with anybody at the bar who wants to. The other question is about, a lot of what we do, of course, is kind of about the past, and that's partly simply realistic. So at the Guildhall, at the minute, we haven't gone very far beyond 1970, because it's one thing to collect bits and pieces of people about bands in the 1970s, and we are beginning to do that. But what I really need is somebody who's got an overview of that period in the same way that Mick and Nigel and I and other people have of the 50s and 60s. Because I can look at that spread of things about the 1950s. People can say to me, well, who were the top bands in Portsmouth? How did they change? How did they sound? What were the great venues and so on? And I can just kind of reel it off now. You know, it's not difficult. We get to 1970 and I haven't got a clue really, because I was playing, you know, harmonica in a blues band in folk clubs, you know, out in the, I don't know, the wilds of Hampshire and so on and so on. I don't know. I didn't go to the marina. I don't know what was going on there. I wasn't. I didn't play at the Tricorn very much when that started. I did play at Basins occasionally, but there was the 657 crew came one day and I didn't go back there anymore. So you know, I just kind of lost touch with all of that. And I think people do need to be able to stand back and take a perspective and then arrange a show and an exhibition. But there are things to do. One of the things I particularly love, dearly love really, is the blog that I run. And as I say, I've got little bits of paper there with information on it if you want to comment on it. Sometimes the blog's completely crazy, and sometimes it's quite funny really, and sometimes just put things up for fun. You know about Frank Kelly and the Hunters? Frank Kelly and the Hunters made 4 singles for Fontana. They were the first beat rock and roll group from the Portsmouth area ever to be professional and make records. And they made 4 records, including Send Me the Pillow That You Dream On. So, darling, I can dream on it too. You see, you remember, you see, yeah. Keith's too young, he don't remember that. Yeah. So you see, so we get, so it just, it's like a spider's web, this, it's extraordinary really. So, and I say, no, I'm not talking about those Paramounts, I'm talking about the Paramounts from Southend-on-Sea who became Procol Harum. And then a guy called Keith Dolan, who went regularly to the Birdcage, he says, I don't think they ever played at the Birdcage, did they? And this is where I get very sad, and I say, They first appeared at Birdcage when it was at the Kimball's Club on Thursday the 22nd of April 1965 and returned quickly on consecutive Thursdays on the 6th and 20th of May, consecutive because of course there was no gig on the 13th of May. Then when the Birdcage, you think that's I am finished. When the Birdcage moved to Eastney, the Paramounts came back in 1966 on Tuesday the 4th of January, Saturday the 19th of February and Friday the 22nd of April. Now, I'm not sure, but I think Ian is at the back. I think you gave me the original Birdcage list, and I'll never really know who quite compiled it. Although I have adjusted
Ian
one or two.
Hebditch, as far as I know.
Oh, was it Ian Hebditch? Okay.
I'm aware.
I haven't even mentioned Ian Hebditch, and I should have
How? I
done
don't
really.
know.
How could I have not mentioned Ian Hebditch? Was a Pompey mod who did fashion at the art college and then went off to a glorious academic career in London, and sadly he's died too. But one of the things he did was he befriended a real mod cult band called The Action, who were going to be the next Beatles. They were picked up by George Martin, but it didn't happen for them. But he wrote a book which his partner Jane finished after he died, and we had a wonderful launch of this book last autumn, I think, up in London, in a club in London, and two members of The Action were there, and there is a whole chapter in it about the Birdcage in Portsmouth. And that's, in a sense, the other key point that I need to make, which is that there is more of the Paramount story, but I think I'll stop. The key point, the other key point I wanted to make is that there are quite a number of academic and journalistic, successful journalistic type people, almost all of them born in the 60s or 70s, so what do they know, who are very prominent publicly in publications. The most famous of them is a man called Dominic Sandbrook, who's written some very good archival research books about the 60s and 70s. All kinds of, political history, economic history and so on and so on. But he keeps saying things like, the swinging 60s never really happened, and on one occasion he went on a television programme and said there were only 14 people who were ever swinging in the 1960s, and they all lived in posh bits of London, and became, top people in the media or whatever. And it's just rubbish. It is just, and it makes me mad as hell, really, because these people had no idea how Portsmouth was transformed in that period from 1959, 1960 through the 1960s. How much the lives of young people, we were young honestly once, young people like a lot of the people in this room, how our lives were transformed. And I'm quite convinced that that's true of other people in other places as well, but in a sense that's none of my business. I think there were particular reasons why Portsmouth was lively at that time. Everywhere had its own constituent population, but we, in addition to that, had a lot of young people who were here in the Navy, and that until about 1963 that included national service, so they were not necessarily willing recruits, but they had money and they had time to spare, and they went out and they kept entertainment venues running, and that was a very important element of it. And the other was that until the mid-60s at least, this was also a successful holiday venue. So again, those venues would run successfully, so economically it was possible for the venues to work, and work they did. But there was another quite extraordinary transformation that went on, and it went on in the folk clubs, and it went on in the Birdcage Club and Kimball's and all sorts of other places, and it went on with people who were enticed by the ideas of the beats and the beatniks and the hippies and the mods and the rockers and so on and so on, and becomes a kind of melting pot. Sometimes people are of the view that all of that was superficial and trivial and so on and so on. Well, the simple point is that we were all about 16 or 17, and it was like being in the most glorious supermarket, really, and we were trying things out. And that's how, for better or worse, we've ended up as we are. But the choices that we were offered were astonishing. And so I am absolutely convinced that those things are worth talking about and reflecting on, in that sense that the life that you don't consider isn't worth living, which somebody else said before me, but I've forgotten who it was now. Socrates, is that right? I think it was him, wasn't it? Yeah. That bloke in the Philosopher's Song by Monty Python, anyway, one of them. So the question is where next, and I don't know really. Keep the blog going. I'm not sure that I'll ever write another book, but I might do. But there is at least one thing that's happening, and that's partly what Nigel's doing tonight, which is that we're now going high tech, which is that he's now in the business of interviewing people and creating a DVD, and maybe that will go on a website and so on and so on, and all of that will. We'll develop it further. And every time I think I've finished, something happens, like the grammar school comes along and says, could you just do this little booklet on the monograph on Paul Jones? So my hope is it'll keep going, you know, as long as, you know, Mick and Nigel and I and the rest of us are breathing and sane and so on and so on. And when we're not any longer, then it'll be your job. Is that okay? Yeah, so I hope you've learned that lesson. There's some more young people. There they are, yes, it'll be your job. Okay, don't forget that. And the serious point I'd want to make it is that actually it's an awful lot of fun. I have a wonderful time doing this. I mean, it's just astonishing, really. And I've made so many friends, and that's delightful. Which is a kind of meandering way of coming to a conclusion, I suspect. But do you want to ask questions or say anything at this point, or you had completely no? Yeah, go on.
Have you done any research on the dance of words? Have you heard of the dance of words?
I was there.
I was there as well. And I've got the programme, and I was looking everywhere. We can't find it. But
I've got the programme, so I could do your copy of it.
Can we have it back?
But was it? But I don't know whether many people know about that, because it was 14 hours long.
How many people remember the dance of words? Somebody remembers. Nigel, you were there, weren't you? Coconut Mushroom played there. Well, yeah, I won't tell you about it. It was May 1968, and there were a pair of guys called Guff Potofsky and Jerry somebody, who I can't remember, who were university students. Yeah, they were students doing, I think, history or something in Mildam. Yeah, and this was, you've got to remember, this was in the days when it was a college of technology. It was a pretty hard-line college, and there were two developments going on at the time. And again, this is part of this swinging 60s context. So in London, oh god, this is the 3-hour version, but I'll try and cut it down. In London, there's a guy called Jim Haynes who's come from Scotland, and he's created things called Arts Labs, where they show experimental movies. They're showing a lot of avant-garde movies from America, Andy Warhol stuff and things like that. There's probably lots of drugs and sex going on all over the place in these places. And this is not Portsmouth, of course. Portsmouth was fine, but in these places. And the students, the architecture students, create something called an arts workshop. And one of the places they go to is K Block, which is just south of the Guildhall and Park Building, and it was like stables. And it's actually, Harry, one of the places that Mark played. Yeah, he came with Steve Peregrine Took as complete. We'd never heard of him. John Peel was booked that night, and he just came and rabbited a bit like me. And he said, "I brought these young musicians, and they sat in corner. They looked like pixies, sat in the corner, and they played acoustically." Yeah. And there was a group called the Exploding Galaxy who went out and did street theatre and frightened all the locals, and I think the sailors beat them up. I'm not sure, but you know, there was Alexis Corner went at one time and told everybody to go home and get their guitars and come back and have a big jam, and there was all that. Alongside that, there were these guys, Guff and Jerry, and this, I mean, it was an extraordinarily time for experimental stuff, and it was a time when music was a part of all of that. And these guys, Guff and Jerry, booked this thing called the Dance of Words at the Guildhall, and it was across the whole ground floor of the Guildhall, not just the main stage, the whole ground floor. And there were some quite significant rock events there. I've got a feeling Alexis Corner didn't turn up, but he was supposed to come back by this band nobody'd ever heard of called Free. But Free certainly did turn up. They certainly played. The first time I'd ever seen them. It was the second time ever that Sandy Denny sang with Fairport Convention, and they were just magical. I do remember them to this day. But there were all sorts of other extraordinary things. There were kind of experimental jazz groups, and there was jazz and poetry in the little sidebars and things. And people, you know, everybody wandered about with flowers in their hair and smoked joss sticks and, you know, all that kind of thing. And there is a full-page article about it in the Evening News from May 1968, which you can still see on microfilm. Or you can come to my house and see it in my scrapbook if you want, because it is there.
It was fabulous. It was
unbelievable. Yeah. It was one of those. I was playing in a straight-ahead soul band at the time, an 8-piece soul band, playing Otis Redding and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, I wonder if I want to be doing something different. It was a quite extraordinary shift, really. And it was one of those first events where everybody sat cross-legged on the floor and listened to music
Yeah.
instead of, some people dance, there is, you know.